What is poppin' YouTube? Back in with another video. Today we're doing my top 12 running back rankings for 2023 fantasy football. Super exciting. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We're trying to get to 500 subscribers by the time the season starts. So I want you here alongside me in this journey. Let's go. The first player in my running back rankings is going to be Christian McCaffrey. There is no reason to deter to go anywhere else other than CMC. Now I know last season, Austin Ekeler outscored him. I totally understand that. But when we saw CMC on the 49ers, we absolutely saw the old CMC, the way he was utilized, where we're seeing the high-end receptions. We're seeing a ton of rushing yards, a ton of rushing attempts, which makes us excited because the last few years, if we don't remember, 2 years ago in 2020, only played 3 games. 2021, only played 7 games. And then, of course, last season, played 17 total games. 21 fantasy points per game, put him as the RB2. Now, another year with Kyle Shanahan in this 49ers offense, with the great offensive line, with all the weapons around CMC. I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about CMC again in that 21, 22, 23 fantasy points per game season, which is why we're taking him as the RB1. My RB2 is going to be Austin Ekeler. And you're probably going to be saying to yourself, well, Caleb, Austin Ekeler's finished as the RB1 last season, and then the year before that was RB2. So why are you taking CMC over Austin Ekeler? For me, it really just comes down to the fact that I think a little bit of the touchdown dependency that Austin Ekeler has had the last few seasons, it's just been super high. So if we look in 2020, he only had 3 total touchdowns. The 2021 had 20 total touchdowns. And if we look at last season, had 18 total touchdowns. Compared to if we look at CMC, only had 13 total touchdowns in 2022, and they were super close together. So for me, yes, Austin Ekeler is an absolute touchdown machine. They didn't bring anyone highly in the backfield for the Chargers, but I just can't see that if something were to happen to that touchdown upside for Austin Ekeler, overall RB3, RB4, but he really depends on those touchdowns. So for me, as someone that's evaluating this running back landscape, I will take CMC, who has a little bit more path to volume, has done it without having to get elite level touchdown numbers. But Austin Ekeler is my RB2. I'm going to be super happy if I have to settle for Austin Ekeler because CMC isn't there. Going to feel really great about Austin Ekeler as my RB2. My RB3 is going to be none other than Bijan Robinson, rookie, Atlanta Falcons, generational type prospect. If all of us remember, anytime these running backs get drafted top 10, last guy was Saquon Barkley, and they come out in the rookie season, they put up elite level fantasy numbers. And we know that we want to get these running backs as young, when they're most athletic, when they don't have a ton of miles on their body. If the thing that we look, even if we were to look at player profiler, all the stats, all the tape blow off the charts. For me, what makes me really excited about Bijan Robinson this season is the fact that the Atlanta Falcons ran the ball the second most times last season. Now, for all of us that love Drake London and Kyle Pitts, that isn't great to hear, but for those of us drafting Bijan Robinson in our fantasy football leagues, let's go. Bijan Robinson is going to be the focal point of the Atlanta Falcons offense, and for that reason alone, when you have a high-end running team with a high-level running back prospect, that makes us super excited. And I think, especially with having Kyle Pitts and Drake London back full together, they're just not going to be able to stack the box on Bijan Robinson all the time. We're hoping Desmond Ridder's going to be better, but even if they're not, they're going to have to rely on that running game with the second-year Desmond Ridder. So Bijan Robinson, for me, easy RB3 here, has a ton of upside. You could potentially see him get in that 18 to 20 fantasy points per game, and that is exactly why I'm taking Bijan Robinson as my RB3. A little bit unknown, but when you're in your fantasy football drafts, sometimes you strike gold in the first round, and I think Bijan Robinson can be that gold in 2023 fantasy football. My RB4 is going to be Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, the emergence that he had last season, coming off of back-to-back years where he kind of had injuries. Back in 2021, he did play in 13 games, but only had 11.4 fantasy points per game. But last season in 2022, 17.8 fantasy points per game, put him as the RB5, 295 rushing attempts, 57 receptions, 10 total touchdowns. Now, a lot of people were scared, of course, because Saquon Barkley was threatening to hold out. People were a little bit worried about how that was going to look for Saquon Barkley in this New York Giants offense. No worries. Saquon Barkley gets a deal done where he gets essentially a $2 million bonus on top of what he would have gotten with the tag. So obviously not great in the running back market, but for Saquon, we know that he's going to be at training camp, which is great for Saquon Barkley's fantasy football value. And that is why I have him as my RB4, because I think even in this New York Giants offense, we add Darren Waller, we improve the offensive line, they have a bazillion slot wide receivers, the offense can only get better, and they still made the playoffs last season. So I'm excited for Saquon Barkley. I think we could see Saquon Barkley get back just another year, 2 years removed from the ACL. He should be back up to 100% healthy, back to full strength. We could see Saquon Barkley get back to kind of the fantasy football points per game numbers that he had in his rookie season, where he had 24 fantasy points per game. Now, I'm not saying he's going to get to 24. That would obviously probably put him as the RB1 this season, but I think if we could easily project out Saquon Barkley to get in that 20 to 21 fantasy points per game, which could have him flirting with RB3, but getting him as the RB4 overall in fantasy football makes me feel really great. My RB5 is going to be Derrek Henry. Now, Derrek Henry, I just said about Bijan, we love to get these running backs when they're young, but there's something about a guy who just has consistency and has been doing it year after year after year. And so I know there's probably some other running backs that you would prefer to take over Derrek Henry. I hear you on that. But for me, I'm taking the guy that just continues to put up elite fantasy football numbers season after season. I mean, last season, RB4 on a fantasy points per game basis. The year before that, only played in 8 games, but averaged 24.2 fantasy points per game in that season. 20.8 the year before that. 19.6 the year before that. I mean, we're talking about a guy that's put up 4 solid years of almost top 5 running back point per game production, which to me is why I'm drafting him again this season. Now, if you had any little worry that Derrek Henry was going to be the focal point, they weren't going to be able to throw the ball, teams are going to stack the box. I mean, they stacked the box against the Titans anyway. When we look at Derrek Henry, now add DeAndre Hopkins, you have Treylon Burks, Ryan Tannehill. As much as some people hate him as a fantasy football quarterback, he's a very solid quarterback in the NFL. So for me, Derrek Henry, all wheels are up for him again this season. I know at some point these running backs do fall off. Age does hit them. So maybe this is the year. But I think when you're talking about the RB5 overall, where Derrek Henry honestly only finishes in the top 5 if he plays a whole season. And like I said, we can't project injuries. So we're not projecting any type of injuries. And Derrek Henry has been the ultimate Iron Man. I'm taking Derrek Henry as my RB5. Love me some Derrek Henry this year, and that's why I'm drafting him as my RB5. My RB6 is going to be Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor, we did have all these rumors come out. His dynasty value is kind of taking a hit because it's clear that he's a little bit unhappy and potentially might hold out. But I think at this point in your fantasy football drafts, when you're talking about Jonathan Taylor as the RB6, it is worth the risk we take. Because if we remember, his rookie season, RB8 fantasy points per game was 16.9. 2021 was his massive breakout year where he was the RB1 with 22 fantasy points per game. And then last season, in of the 11 games that he played, only 13.3 fantasy points per game. But if any of us watched the Colts offense, I mean, you literally had dysfunction all across the coaching staff with Jeff Saturday coming in halfway through the year. You had literally zero quarterback play. And not to say that Anthony Richardson is going to solve everything for the Colts, going to solve everything from Jonathan Taylor, because if we're going to be honest with ourselves, if Anthony Richardson is the athletic type of quarterback, all the measurables, everything is pointing to, then there's 20 touchdowns that he had in his 2021 amazing RB1 campaign. There's a good chance that he's not going to get to 20 total touchdowns, but I think there is a good chance that maybe finds the middle of that, maybe gets to 11, 12 touchdowns. And if he does that, we're talking about Jonathan Taylor probably in that RB5 to RB7 range. And so getting him here, right here at the RB6 is where I feel really comfortable, because if everything goes right for Jonathan Taylor, we've seen the elite level upside, but if he kind of regresses more to that mean, we're going to be getting a pretty good value with him right here at RB6. So Jonathan Taylor is my RB6 in my running back rankings. My RB7 in fantasy football for 2023 is going to be Tony Pollard. Now, Tony Pollard on Twitter, a lot of people are debating Tony Pollard because there's a lot of truthers and there's a lot of haters. And I'll be honest, I think Tony Pollard, when he's getting drafted ahead of Derrek Henry, getting drafted ahead of Jonathan Taylor, it's a little bit rich for my taste. And that's been happening in some underdog leagues that I've been drafting on. But Tony Pollard right here has elite level upside. Now, Tony Pollard last season finishes as the RB8 with 15.6 fantasy points per game. But the thing that we have to remember about last season, he was still splitting work with Zeke. And now they haven't brought anybody in, so it's looking like at this moment that I'm recording, I'm literally recording on Tuesday, August 1st. This is coming out on Wednesday. But Tony Pollard, they haven't signed anybody to compete in the goal line work for me. And so that's what makes me super excited for a guy who had 12 total touchdowns last season, but Zeke had 12 total touchdowns as well. So we had 24 touchdowns in the Cowboys backfield. And if all of a sudden, if Tony Pollard can get 2, 3 more of those, we're talking about Tony Pollard potentially having a little bit higher of a ceiling. We're talking about him as an RB5, RB6. And if he gets all of those extra 12, I mean, we're talking about Tony Pollard, who has RB1 upside. Now, for me, I think the guys ahead of him, I think Derrek Henry, I think Jonathan Taylor a little bit more secure. But I think Tony Pollard has proven that he is a great out of the backfield, super fast, elusive, and he does have that receiving upside. So Tony Pollard's the full package. So if I miss out on those guys ahead of him, and I'm stuck with Tony Pollard as my RB1 in fantasy football, I'm super happy about it. So Tony Pollard is my RB7. My RB8 is going to be Nick Chubb. Now, Nick Chubb, a lot of people are excited because Kareem Hunt is out of town. And for the last few years, we've been talking like, oh man, just give Nick Chubb all of the work. And if you give Nick Chubb all the work, he's going to produce amazing fantasy football results. Because the last 2 seasons, RB10 and on a points per game basis, RB6 last season was 16.6. So a lot of people are going to say, oh my gosh, Caleb, if there's no Kareem Hunt for this season, he should be RB4, he should be RB3. All reports are pointing to for the Cleveland Browns that they are going to be a very pass-happy offense. And what is that going to do? Maybe that implies that Nick Chubb is going to get more receiving work. But for me, I think that more implies that Nick Chubb is not going to be getting as many rushing attempts. I mean, last season had 302 rushing attempts for the full season. And just to kind of give you an example of how those carries play out in his whole career, those were the most carries that he had in his whole career. If we look back even to 2019, he had 298 carries, which is the second highest carries that he had in his whole career. But he only averaged 15.9 fantasy points per game, put him as the RB10 in that season back in 2019. So for me, it's hard for for me to say, yes, even if Nick Chubb does get less carries, like 250 to 260, and maybe those receptions go up by 5 to 7, maybe even 10 receptions, it's hard for me to project Nick Chubb out into the top 5 running backs overall. I think Nick Chubb's really solid, especially when you're able to get him at the back end of the first, early part of the second. I mean, he's a solid running back. And he does, if the Cleveland Browns offense absolutely goes berserk this season, yes, Nick Chubb could end up in that top 5 running backs. But I just prefer all the guys ahead of him because I think it's a little bit more clear how you can project out those numbers. So Nick Chubb is my RB8. My RB9 is going to be Josh Jacobs. Now, Josh Jacobs would be higher, 100%. But we have a lot of question marks. First off, we don't know what's happening with the holdout situation. We don't know if he's going to get paid. Is he even going to play? We've seen these running backs. They want their money. Le'Veon Bell style. Not afraid to take off a year, even though my man is already 25 years old. Thinking that he's going to be 26 getting paid kind of feels dumb. But Josh Jacobs last season, 19.3 fantasy points per game, put him as the RB3. Came out of nowhere. Absolutely running back dead zone type of running back. Comes out of nowhere. Essentially wins you your league if you drafted Josh Jacobs in the 5th round. The thing that excites me about Josh Jacobs this season is the Raiders offense is going to be trash. We don't know who the quarterback is going to be. Even if it is Jimmy G, the offense is not going to be good. I mean, it's going to be the Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs show, especially with Darren Waller being out of town. So that is what excites me about Josh Jacobs. I don't think it's going to be back to where it was last season, where we're talking about 304 rushing attempts, 1,600 yards, 12 total touchdowns. I mean, he has seemed to average close to that 10 touchdown range, which could be exciting, but he's also played on some pretty decent offense. I mean, as much as you want to hate on Derek Carr, the offense has been pretty decent the last few seasons. So it's hard for me to project Josh Jacobs when it seems like the Raiders are kind of headed towards a tank for Caleb Williams. It's hard for me to project Josh Jacobs easily out and say, yep, Josh Jacobs, he's going to be better than Nick Chubb. He's going to be better than Tony Pollard. I'd rather have those two guys over Josh Jacobs, but I think this is the point in the draft where Josh Jacobs is kind of in a tier of his own, where as RB9, it's a little bit below Nick Chubb and Tony Pollard, but he's definitely above my next guy at RB10, which is going to be Travis Etienne. Now, a lot of people are a little bit down on Travis Etienne, especially considering the fact that they drafted Tank Bigsby in the 3rd round. Doug Peterson has definitely mentioned, I want it to be a running back by committee approach. But the thing that I think people need to remember is that Travis Etienne actually performed pretty well when he was in a running back by committee with James Robinson at the beginning of last season. And towards the end, he definitely started to take a beating. And so for Travis Etienne's long-term seasonal value, I don't think Tank Bigsby coming in, taking 30 to 35% of the touches is going to hurt him, especially if that can get Travis Etienne back to what he does best, which is really catching the football, which he didn't do a whole lot last season with only 35 receptions. If you don't remember Travis Etienne's profile, because this was 2 years ago when he came in as a rookie, had the Liz Frank injury, upset a lot of people, and then came back last season, is that Travis Etienne was very much so compared to Alvin Kamara, a receiving down back out of the backfield where you could see him getting 60, 65 receptions. And last season with only 35 receptions, it's really hard for us to then project that out this season, especially with Tank Bigsby coming in. But even if the Jacksonville Jaguars takes that next step in efficiency, you add Calvin Ridley, Evan Ingram still there, Christian Kirk, it makes me excited for the total touchdowns because Travis Etienne only had 5 total touchdowns. Now, there are all those videos of Travis Etienne absolutely getting stuffed at the goal line after, 1, 2, 3 times. But I think Travis Etienne makes those improvements into this season, and I think we could be talking about Travis Etienne getting 7, 8, 9 total touchdowns. And with the uptick in rushing attempts, with receptions, I think we're talking easily about Travis Etienne as an RB1, because after this, it gets a little bit chaotic in how you're viewing the running back landscape. My RB11 is going to be Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, if Rhamondre Stevenson didn't have as many question marks, I would be putting Rhamondre over Travis Etienne, but I just can't do it because even though Rhamondre Stevenson finished as the RB10 last season, Bill Belichick loves his running back by committee. I mean, the Patriots have been tied to literally every veteran free agency running back. We're talking about Lenny Fournette. We're talking about Dalvin Cook. If one of those guys comes in, as much as we're like, Rhamondre Stevenson is still going to be a fantasy football value if one of those guys comes into the offense, but it's not going to be good enough for us to then be saying that Rhamondre Stevenson can go above any of these guys because all of a sudden his ceiling is a little bit capped. But still, Rhamondre Stevenson, amazing running back, amazing production last season. Where you were drafting, I mean, last season you were drafting him in the 5th or 6th round. This year you're going to have to be drafting him a little bit earlier than that with his ADP being in the top 30 picks. RB10 last season, I'm having him as my RB11, so kind of right on track. I think he's going to probably do what he did last season. So it's not necessarily going to be game-changing, winning your league type running back production, but I think it's going to be very useful for you, especially if you're someone that maybe drafted a receiver in the 1st round, you're looking for a running back in the 2nd round, or you're just looking to do a really double RB, heavy RB approach. I think Rhamondre Stevenson could definitely play into effect for you as your RB, as my RB11, and someone that you can get a little bit later than some of these other guys. My RB12, and this is where I think we talk about Rhamondre, but there's this little drop off, and that is going to be Najee Harris. Najee Harris to me, is a pure volume play. We've looked at the last 2 seasons. I mean, his rookie season, 307 rushing attempts. The year before, like last year, 272. Now, last year, it wasn't great. RB19, 13.2 fantasy points per game. He kind of let a lot of people down. Now, the thing is, he did battle through a lot of injuries last season that he was able to play through, but that definitely did hurt his efficiency, did hurt his metrics. And then we add in the fact that Kenny Pickett, a rookie quarterback, came in to play, and you know what happens when a rookie quarterback comes in. They start sacking the box. Kenny Pickett didn't perform amazingly well, and as much as I think Kenny Pickett's going to take that next step, I think Najee Harris can kind of mitigate the mean. I don't think he's going to get back to that 17.7 fantasy points per game, which put him as the RB6 his rookie season, but I also don't think he's going to get 13.2 like he did last season. So even if he somehow gets in the middle of that, we're talking about him right here as your RB12 range. And I think to me, that's what makes him exciting, because we have seen he does have, top 6, top 7 running back potential. If the touchdowns were to align, which they did the last 2 seasons, I mean, he did have 10 total touchdowns. The major difference that happened between his rookie season and his sophomore campaign is that his receptions dropped around 30 receptions. And to me, that was the major difference between his rookie season and his sophomore season. So even if his receptions go up, 10, 15 this year, and he's just able to get a few more rushing attempts because his rushing attempts also went down around 35 attempts, we're talking about Najee Harris very cemented as an RB12. And if not, he could be RB10, RB11. But I have Najee Harris as my RB12 in my running back rankings. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back tomorrow with the rest. We're going to be back with RB13 through RB24, giving you guys all the great stats as you're drafting, as you're preparing for your drafts in fantasy football leagues. We're going to be doing some mock drafts. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so you know when we're going live, so you can join those with me as we continue to grind towards fantasy football excellence and get you some championships in 2023. I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.